let's talk about binge eating disorder. There's a lot of shame, embarrassment, and stigma attached to this eating disorder. I'll go into why another time, but it's the eating disorder that I think people find very difficult to talk about because of the association with being very out of control, and also the associated weight gain that sometimes is a consequence of this type of eating disorder. I'm Dr. Simone Gray. I'm a counselling psychologist. I'm also a nutritionist. I've also got a background working as a PT, and I'm a yoga teacher, and my interest is really looking at the very complicated ways that we regulate appetite. So I'm coming at this today from a neurobiological, physiological perspective, and I really want to take away some of the stigma and the shame by looking at this from a kind of perspective where we can see some of the physiological chemical drivers of this particular type of coping with food, and hopefully give you guys some tips on how to, maybe through understanding some of the neurophysiology, neurobiology, you can maybe put in place some strategies to start to heal. So binge eating disorder is eating a large amount of food in a discrete time period, usually about 2 hours, and it also has associated distress and a feeling of being out of control. Now I'm going to talk about what causes binge eating in another video. Today I want to talk to you about some of the neurophysiology, and I've kind of brought it up on my screen behind me so that I'm a bit coherent when I talk about this. The first thing I want to talk about is that this really behaves a little bit like an addiction because it acts on the mesolimbic reward pathway in the brain. So you get some sense of reward through the secretion of dopamine, through the secretion of serotonin, even if you're not eating highly palatable foods with that kind of golden ratio of sugar to fat. You might binge on vegetables, you might binge on iceberg lettuce, but there's something about that very kind of disconnected and sometimes highly impulsive way of eating that has the brain lighting up the reward center. Now afterwards you might feel a sense of regret, remorse, shame, embarrassment. Often binge eating occurs in secret and when you're alone, but nonetheless what will happen is after a binge you'll get a kind of slump in mood because you'll become aware of what you've done consciously, and then it's just a matter of time before your brain drives you to seek dopamine and serotonin again. So this becomes a behaviour which really is about regulating emotion. It's about getting a handle on some of these endocrine neurotransmitters and hormones that help keep your mood buoyant. Now, what also happens as a result of filling the stomach and the gastric system with a massive amount of food in a short space of time is that you'll start to screw around with your satiety cues. So that your hunger and fullness cues will be all out of whack. There are cells in the lining of the stomach that are activated when the stomach actually gets smaller, and they're called chief cells. And when the chief cells get smaller, ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, is secreted. The way that I remembered ghrelin when I was doing my master's was ghrelin makes your stomach grumble. So as your stomach actually, mechanically gets smaller, ghrelin is secreted. Now, if you might be binging like once, twice, 3, 4, 10 times a day, what you've got is your stomach becoming very distended, very large, and then smaller again. So you are priming yourself to be repeatedly overstimulated with ghrelin again and again and again. And so you lose interoceptive awareness of hunger and fullness cues, which makes it very hard for you to use your executive function, your prefrontal cortex, to stage an intervention and go, no, I'm not going to binge, because you've actually got hunger signals telling you need food. You've actually got the reward center of the brain driving you to get a dopamine hit. You've actually got reduced serotonin, so you'll be looking for an easy and quick fix to drive serotonin up again. All of this also adds to a real difficulty with impulse control. Now, the way that I often conceptualize binge eating is that it is your window of needs as a child were intermittent and opened very narrowly. So you've learned that if that window to get your needs met is open, you've got to get in there and you've got to binge really quickly. This is not always true. Not everybody with binge eating disorder has a very impulsive child part, but I would say in many cases they do. So this is about impulse control, and when you meet your impulses, the kind of gap between that trigger, the impulse is there, and meeting the impulse, so stimulus response, the gap becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. It becomes a slither, and so you lose that capacity to actually regulate impulse control. This can make it much harder to resist the urge to binge, and it makes the period between binges much shorter because, of course, all of that drives tension and it lowers mood, and it makes you feel really bad about yourself because you're just on this constant merry-go-round where you're stuck all the time. So I've talked a little bit about hunger hormones. I've talked a little bit about kind of those feel-good endocrine system hormones like dopamine, serotonin, the reward center, the parts of the brain which help you kind of have interoceptive cues of hunger and fullness, and also that kind of impulse control drive. And what I'm hoping is that you hear what I'm saying and you recognize that there are, yes, emotional reasons why you've got this binge eating problem, but there are also very valid physiological, neurological, chemical reasons why it is incredibly hard to break this very addictive cycle. I'm going to talk more about how you break the addictive cycle in other videos. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. Bye.